Now it is my pleasure to introduce this morning's Big Ideas program. A is for Advocacy. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available for free on ALSC's website, thanks to a generous sponsorship from the Carol D. Fiore Leadership Fund. Now I'm going to turn things back over to Jamie so he can introduce the session.
All right, so our panel today, you have descriptions of who we are that's been on the website, and we have a lot of stuff that we want to share with you, so we're not going to take time to introduce ourselves. Instead, we're here, we're talking, and we have lots of ideas that hopefully you can use, but we won't just be sage on the stage. So after we share some things with you, there'll be a microphone at the end, the back of the room, and we'll have time at the end for you to ask us questions and interact with us. So to start out with, our panel is A is for Advocacy. We are talking about advocacy. Well, why should you advocate? Is it really part of your job? Did you learn about that in library school? Should you be an advocate? The answer is yes. Whether you learned about it or not, you should be an advocate. Who should you advocate for? With whom? Are you doing it alone? Don't do it alone. There's lots of other people that would love to work with you. You can do more working with other people. And so we're going to talk about, throughout this session, various different ways that you can advocate. So how are you going to advocate? So follow along. We're going to give you some ideas. We're going to talk about some general things, some general information, and then we're also going to give you some tips of how you can apply that in your current everyday work. So we're going to divide this out into 4 sections. 4 sections are reframing, renaming, reclaiming, and contributing. And these are all part of the transformative literature in schools and communities, which is based on Pat Incioso's original research, and it will be forthcoming. But we're taking some of her ideas and adding some of our own to that and expanding upon that. So Sarah is going to talk first about reframing, and then you can see the list there. I'll be renaming, Pat will be reclaiming, and Edie will be contributing. So Sarah?
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to be sharing with you this morning. So reframing is recognizing the importance of shifting from deficit and damage narratives to narratives of strength and potential. And this is based on indigenous decolonizing theory. If this is unfamiliar to you, I really encourage you to look it up and also to read Tuck and Yang's Decolonizing is Not a Metaphor, to understand sort of the complexity of using decolonization theory as a metaphor. So we need to reframe how we think about children's literature and the children and families this literature represents. This literature exists as products of various systems and industries, publishing, librarianship, education, etc. And by understanding these systems and industries, we can reframe how we evaluate the kinds of narratives that exist, and we can better advocate for the kinds of narratives we want. Okay. So in 2015, I worked with Lee and Lowe to administer the first diversity baseline survey. We administered the survey to 34 publishers and 8 review journals with a response rate of 25%. It's the largest survey of its kind. We found that publishing is 79% white, 78% female, 88% cisgender, and 92% non-disabled. The 79% white is similar to librarianship at 88% white and education at 82% white. Consider the implications of a relatively homogeneous publishing industry. Lee and Lowe will administer the second diversity baseline survey next year, so hopefully we'll soon have data on whether or not and how the publishing industry has changed since 2015. In 2016, I worked with illustrator David Hike and writer Molly Beth Griffin to create this infographic. The numbers are based on the data produced by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Education. The 4 numbers on the left add up to 14.2%, but let's break it down. This 14.2% includes all books that depict Native characters and characters of color. So it's already a small percentage, given that over 30% of all people in this country and 50% of our children are IPOC. Consider that some of these images will be stereotypes and distortions, funhouse and cracked mirrors. Consider that some may be heavily folklore or historical in terms of genre, or cover a limited number of topics. Consider that many of these books are not written by own voices or people with the lived experiences depicted in them. We can see the trends and gaps in authorship more clearly in this graph created by Emily Midkiff. The dotted line represents books that are about Black, Native, Asian, and Latinx writers. The solid represents books that are by people from these communities. Notice how big the gaps are and how they increase over time. Pulling out one example, you can see that the gap between books that are by and about African Americans has actually grown in the past several years. So specifically, 336 books were about African and African Americans. 100 were written and or illustrated by Black book creators. So that means that 236 out of 336, or 70% of the books were created by people who are not Black. In 2016, Edie said it best on her blog, quote, "The call came out for more diverse books, and white writers asked, how can I write diverse characters when they should have asked, how can I support authors of color?" End quote. So some of my takeaways is we need to think about redefining the canon. We don't want just white male authors, pale, male, and stale, to, to dominate the reading list that we share with children. We want more books that are created by authors and illustrators of color, people who live with different abilities, people who identify as queer. We want to make sure that all people in this country are represented in their own voices. If you're familiar with The Danger of a Single Story, it's a TED Talk written by Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian novelist. But basically, she talks about how a lot of communities are represented by a single story. So the overwhelming presence of slavery in children's books, or how Martin Luther King is often held up as, the one male person during Black History Month. So these are all single stories that dominate representations of particular communities, and we really need to make sure that we have a lot of different kinds of stories showing the great diversity within specific communities. And then Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sympathizer, he talks about, in one of his other books, narrative scarcity versus narrative plenitude. And this became more mainstream recently during the Crazy Rich Asians premiere. The actress playing Rachel Lee talked about how we need more movies depicting Asian Americans, and we don't have enough. So Joy Luck Club 25 years ago was the first mainstream movie depicting Asian Americans, and then Crazy Rich Asians is only the second, that is, where the cast is completely Asian American. And we're in a state of scarcity right now, but we need to get to a state of plenitude so we can have a lot of different types of movies. So we encourage you to reframe what you learn as you go through the Institute. When we think of books, we think about how they fit into our collections. What demographic is well represented in your collection? Are most of your books own voices, etc.? So think about all of these things. Think about all the things my colleagues are going to say as you go through the Institute. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to talk about renaming, and I know that's a lot of text on the screen. This is the only slide with all that text. So renaming, what do we mean by renaming? Renaming is recognizing that our stories help us name the everyday and imagine ourselves and others in the world as capable, fully humanized characters. That renaming is all about how stories help us see the world in new ways. Or conversely, the renaming is all about those stories that, if we don't have the right stories, the stories reinforce and reproduce static images and narratives. So we need to reframe so that we can have those fresh stories. Human nature is such that if we hear a book is about someone different from us, we create a us versus them narrative. And a wall comes up that really prevents us from connecting with the narrative in the story. So as librarians, sometimes we are guilty of creating othering book talks. So we want to excuse the expression. I use this all the time with my students. We want to pimp our collection. So when you're pimping your collection, we want to pimp our diverse books. We want people reading them. But sometimes when we are doing our pitches, rather than centering the pitch on the exciting adventure and suspenseful plot and a story that's going to draw in a lot of listeners from lots of different cultural backgrounds, we engage in othering book talks instead, where we say, hey, this is a really good book about an Asian American that blah, 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 blah. Instead of saying, this is an exciting story about a girl and her dragon and blah, 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 blah. So, it's how you frame it, and that determines who's going to want to read that book. whether those walls come up. Because if you say it's about an Asian American, wow, we want all kids to read that book. If they're not Asian American, bam, first wall comes up. And then if you start saying, it's about an Asian American who just also happens to be, I don't know, Jewish, then bam, I'm not Jewish. So I'm not, so you're throwing walls up every time you do that as othering and rather centering that. Something else to think about in renaming is reading against the grain. And here, I know this is a long URL, but if you just go to tolerance.org, they have classroom resources for teaching tolerance magazine. If you go to their website, they have an activity that you can do, which is reading against the grain. Part of that is thinking about who's not being represented in the stories that you share. So this is an activity you could do with older elementary kids. So we're reading a book. Well, whose perspective are we not hearing? What types of families are we not seeing? What types of characters are we not seeing? Who is the main character there? But then who are all the voices that are being silenced? And why are they being silenced? And the idea that everybody that creates a book brings their own personal agenda to creating it. And the publishers have their own personal agendas when they create books. And so that ends up with whose narratives we have and whose we don't have. So it's also important to think about whose books we don't have and what stories are being promoted in our story times or in our programs and our book talks and our displays. Something else to think about in renaming is strength-based, sometimes it's also called assets-based thinking when we're thinking about doing outreach to diverse populations versus deficit-based thinking. Now, this can be thought of in two different ways. One way is that you yourself should be thinking about strength-based and how you can get your patrons moving into a strength-based type of learning. Or you can also think about how this applies to specific people. So you're moving from assets to strength-based thinking where we rename and redefine how we approach outreach to diverse populations, collections, services, and programs. It moves it goes into empowerment rather than us as a white savior person from the outside are coming in to help this diverse group do something. So with a strength-based narrative, you're focusing on what's working rather than what's broken. And what you're focusing on emphasizing the possibilities in a situation, emphasizing a possibility for a group of people rather than helping them overcome their weaknesses. You're thinking about sustainable solutions to a problem rather than short-term things that are only going to be a stopgap solution. So thinking strategically, planning strategically. Part of this also goes back to when you're creating a program, and right now I'm teaching a class on outreach to diverse populations with my students. And so we talk about doing diversity programming, and a lot of people, sometimes they do a one-shot, okay, we're going to create this program, this is a program, we're going to bring in this population, this Latinx community, it's going to be great, they're going to enjoy it, they're going to feel welcome to the library, they do it, they plan it, nobody comes. And they're like, well, did it, tried it, didn't work, and they move on. Well, no, you can't. It's not just a one-stop gap solution. You need to think about, well, why didn't it work? And then so work with that population and find out, well, what are the barriers? Why, but work with them, empowering them to help you plan the program, not you coming and saving them and giving them what they need. Something else to think about in renaming is examining the names of things, literally, renaming. So looking at literary awards, thinking about the names of those awards. What do they convey about certain groups of people? Are they reinforcing stereotypes? Thinking about buildings that are named after people. What are those buildings? Are they named after slave owners? Are they named after people that were aggressive and really mean and hateful to certain groups of people? And what does that say to people that continue to use those buildings or see those mascots in stadiums or see those statues in parks? Something else literally for renaming is pronouns, the pronouns that we use. Some people don't identify with he and she pronouns. There are other pronouns that are available. So if you go to transstudent.org, they have a lot of wonderful graphics. And so this is a graphic there of different pronouns that you can use. And when you're reading a story during story time, changing pronouns to make things more inclusive. Or you can see here, this is a library in Oak Park, a library in Illinois, and this says, ask me about my pronouns. And so that kind of creates that conversation of, and some libraries have it, the staff have it on their badges where people ask them about their pronouns. So renaming is also just thinking about what pronouns we use and what walls those put up. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pat, who's going to talk about reclaiming.
Thanks. presenter tools up. First of all, I'm really honored to be here. I feel like an interloper in some ways, but my work in children's literature and children's literature in education specifically has meant I've been watching closely what happens in the library world and what so many of you are contributing to advocacy and change. So I applaud all of the work that's going on in libraries today. What I want to talk about is work that's actually been going on for generations. As people of color, Indigenous and people of color have been advocating for their children to be seen as children. And that work has many strands of scholarship. More recently, it's becoming more visible, I think, in education and in more public reports, including a 2017 GAO report. Like, the government has gotten in on this. And a wonderful article by Dumas and Nelson in 2016 in the Harvard Ed Review, in which they're talking about reclaiming Black boyhoods. So what I want to talk about briefly are sort of three dimensions of this work: the recognition of social inequality, the representation and misrepresentation of childhoods in literature, and the ways these representations then have an impact on children's reading in school, along with some of the reading programs. So I'm going to quote a little bit from this article about the GAO 2017 report on racial disparities in punishment. And it's an examination of racial disparities in punishment across all school settings, not just high poverty schools, all school settings. And the author argues, this is from a 2014 earlier report, children in most societies are considered to be in a distinct group with characteristics such as innocence and the need for protection. Non-dominant children, however, are subject to greater and more consequential punishment for being childlike. Our research found that Black boys can be seen as responsible for their actions at an age when white boys still benefit from the assumption that children are essentially innocent. A 2014 study, for example, found that people generally view Black boys as older and less innocent starting at the age of 10. Another study released in 2017 produced similar results, finding that Americans overall view Black girls as less innocent and more mature for their age from ages 5 to 14. Survey respondents were more likely to say that Black girls compared to white girls need less nurturing, less protection, to be supported less, to be comforted less, are more independent, know more about adult topics, and know more about sex. The researchers described this as the adultification of Black girls. If people are more likely to view Black children as less innocent and older, they may be more likely to accept harsher punishments against these kids. And the 2017 GAO study suggests this is indeed the case. It's backed by considerable research. If this is true, I accept it as true. I think there's plenty of evidence. We can just look at the news and the lives of Black children and Latinx children that are at extreme risk. So what do we do in libraries? How do we work coalitionally and as advocates to reclaim childhoods? And how in the world does literature matter? Well, first of all, I'd like to say that we need to increase opportunities for adults and youth to read and respond to more delightful, realistic depictions of their experiences. Kids are silly, loud, joyful, they get upset, they're resistant, and that can look like it's out of line. It can appear to be aggressive, but it can also be reinterpreted as childhoods and children at play. So we need to look at books like Radiant Child and look at the mess that a brilliant child can make and embrace that. We need to look at a story like Moon Over Star, where children are playing and imagining futures for themselves. And we need to look at Kamala Khan and her capacity to transform in a superhero narrative. How's this going? Okay, I'm doing two things at once here. Okay. So whose childhood counts? There are, as Sarah is saying, spectacular books showing brown and black and indigenous children as engaged in play, imagining and creating lives on their terms, within loving and supportive families. But there are, however, still books circulating that limit fully humanizing representations of black and brown and indigenous youth. So Radine Sims Bishop's talked about social conscience books, in which non-dominant children are positioned as pivots for white children's innocence and emotional and social educations. Maniac McGee is the primary example for me. It's now celebrating its 25th anniversary. More recently, Robin Bernstein described how innocence associated with whiteness always contrasts with depictions of troubled or less desirable childhoods for black children. And I'm quoting her here, "As long as white children are constructed as innocent, we must continue to demand that children of color are as well. Because the idea of childhood innocence carries so much political force, we can't allow it to be a whites-only club." Similarly, Debbie Reese has talked about the way in which indigenous settings are used as backdrop for a kind of mystery or authenticity, but leaves the trauma of indigenous experience in the background and unacknowledged for indigenous children and their families. I've put Skippy John Jones there because at the expense of Latinx children's heritage languages, we get a very snappy little character, and it's a very troubling depiction. It's very humiliating for Latinx children, whose childhoods are robbed essentially so that white children can enjoy the fun of that language play. Where am I? I'm doing two things here. Okay. So this has implications for reading. So if kids are reading these stories over and over again in schools where indigenous and people of color are reading narratives that position them as children as less than, they're experiencing reading as a threat. It feels like a threat, one that is not open to, and when it feels like a threat, and when the stereotype threat is present, it means that children are less likely to be engaged in the kinds of work that reading requires: hypothesizing, risk-taking, connecting, engaging in social interaction around these texts, in which they're expected to perform as proficient readers. This means that a lot of reading education today is being shaped by people who are not only not close to the children, they're extremely removed from the lives of children. The textbook industry, which is really situated in Texas, is shaping the reading curriculum and has for I don't know, decades. And when that's the case, teachers themselves, and especially teachers of color, are displaced from the dialogue around which we should be talking about how to reimagine the placement of literature in children's lives. I've listed the Silence Dialog here from Lisa Delpit. It's an article that you should go back and read again. It was in the Harvard Ed Review, I think in '91. No, earlier than that, the '80s. But it's the last part of that that's a really amazing piece, a really inspiring piece, in which she talks about how we need to humanize one another, and we do that through dialogue. I think we can be looking for more of these narratives that produce counter-storytelling, transformative storytelling, and use kids' knowledge. They're often politicized funds of knowledge, not just general family community funds of knowledge. And then I'm going to happily turn this over to Edie, who's really going to sort of build on what I'm talking about here, which is how to reclaim those spaces for childhood. Look in your libraries. I'm just going to point to the very last point, which is review and amend policies and procedures related to behavior, and ask yourselves, how does this make sense for the childhoods of the children that we are serving? How are these policies really working and not working on their behalf? Thanks.
Sorry. Good morning. To give a brief summary to what we've said this morning, we're considering that reading should not be a threat to anyone. The last thing reading should be is a threat. What we're talking about is extending work that has been done for well over 100 years. I pulled up an article just yesterday that was written by Langston Hughes in 1931 that talked about having books available for people of color, particularly for African Americans, who can be read and enjoyed because the representation is accurate. 1931, and we're still having the same conversation. This morning we talked about shifting from a deficit narrative to decolonized narratives that are asset-based. I think, Jamie, you mentioned that this morning. We're renaming, we are reframing, we are pimping diverse books, we are moving beyond single stories that create a sense of others. We're moving away from that mindset of there are too few diverse books to celebrating the fact that in 2018, the Newbery List was composed completely by authors of color. We're celebrating 50 years of the CSK Awards. And as a YALSA member, as a past member of the Prince Committee, I do have to mention that we're also recognizing the extreme diversity of this year's Prince Award. The first open lesbian to win the award, a middle grade crossover that was an honor book on the list, the racial diversity of the list. Hashtag narrative plenitude. We're working collaboratively. I can't say it, but we're doing it. We're working collaboratively across groups. We're counter storytelling, and we're recognizing community cultural wealth. So what else can we do as librarians and as educators? I remember the last time I presented with Jamie and with Sarah, one of the questions we got that really gave us pause was, it's hard in library land. You know, it's hard. You know, you can say these great things, but really, what can we do? So I really worked to try and come up with some practical ideas of what we can do in libraries to make a change. And I say we because I'm in a library too, and I have those same struggles of how to make change for my users. There will be pushback. It will not be easy. Be ready for the pushback. No, it's going to be there. This is not just about books. We're contributing to a possible future that is much bigger than books. There's a capital W whiteness that we're fighting against. We're not asking you to be a Milano. You know what a Milano is, right? A cookie that is white on the inside and chocolate, a little chocolate strip. That's what we're asking you to do. But we are asking you to recognize spaces for IPOC people, for LGBT people, and for disabled people, so that we can be every bit as proud and as privileged and as literate and as employed and as skilled to matter just as much. Capital letter W prevents this from happening. We're not asking you to save us. We do not need saviors. We simply want you to recognize our humanity. We want you to accompany us, to contribute with us to change the world. Join us in the big and little ways so that our children can live beyond this nonsense and they can thrive. So how can we do this? Prepare yourself. Pick your battles. You can't change everything. Start with the small ones. Start with things that you can accomplish. These are some of the things I'm learning along the way. Connect with like-minded people. Use social media to find people outside your library who can give you strength and support. Connect with people locally. Know the people not only who work with you, but who visit your library, who share your ideas, and who know that things need to change. You are a change agent. One thing I really enjoyed about library school, and as a school librarian, we were taught that we are library leaders. Librarians are leaders. And as a change agent, we don't have to stay in one place. Be aware of what else is out there for you. Stay current in your librarianship. People say librarianship is dying. It is not. It has never been dying. It continually changes and evolves. If you're going to be a change agent, you must be aware of those changes. Know your community. Know what resources are available, what agencies are in your community, what schools. Who does your library partner with, and who is available for partnerships? What does your community expect from your library? Know the language of the people you serve, not just their international language, not just their Vietnamese or their Spanish, but know their colloquialisms. Know how they communicate with each other. What do they like to read? Who are the community leaders? Do they visit your library? And if they don't, why not? If they do, what areas of your library are they most likely to visit? Does your community support the library? You need, as a librarian, to create ways for them to create to the library and to the community through the library. Get to know your community needs. Listen to what they request. Don't put your energy into creating to eliminate book fines when what your community really wants are signs in their own language. Find out what your community needs, empower their voices, and find ways for them to contribute to change. You'll empower them. We didn't become librarians because we want to be rich and powerful. Librarianship is about service, and we want our users to be empowered. That's what being literate is. It's knowing how to read the word and the world and using that information to create spaces in the world. Know your library. I think I might be on the wrong slide up there. Okay, sorry. Know your library. Know who the power players are inside your library. Know the culture of your library's ecosystem. Read the strategic plan, the goals, the policies, and the procedures so that you can use the language of your library in your work. Know who they collaborate with. Know all of your colleagues' strengths and weaknesses. We're not up against our colleagues. For the most part, what we're really up against is that attitude of, we've always done it this way. And that is very hard to fight, but we're going to find a way to do that. Join committees. Be active in your library and in your community. Be an asset to your library. Don't give up. There are big ways you can work to make changes, not just inside your library, but for literacy in general. And some of those big ways are consider some of the organizations that you're giving your time and energy to. I'm thinking particularly of some of those state library and literacy organizations. Use your librarian skills to evaluate their stated purpose and goals. Who are their leaders? What do they look like? What do they stand for? Are they forward-thinking? Is this really a 21st century organization? Challenge their lack of inclusion and accessibility. Challenge them when they have panels and conferences to have presenters of color, to have LGBT people presenting as well. How accessible are those their events? Support some existing organizations as well. Project Lit is a really good one. It started in Nashville by a teacher who was building local small libraries, but it's grown to 400 chapters in 46 states where teachers lead book discussion groups across the country. Quelly is a color of our Children's Literature Conference. They also have a journal. Support them. Think about on a local level, I'm trying to rush, I think I have maybe a minute left now. On a local scale, make sure you're reading diversely. And diversely in that way, there's a whole lot of connotations, not just gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, but read newspapers, read graphic novels, read what your users are using. Up your tech skills, and as you're learning those tech skills, make sure you're taking your users along that with you. Rural librarians, people in urban areas, our children are left out of this tech stuff. And tech is the future. If we are not part of that movement, if we don't know what's going on, we'll be left behind, and that's going to be disastrous for our future. So as you continue to learn those things, make sure you're taking your users along with you. Be purposeful in the organization of materials. Challenge where your books are being placed. Challenge being LGBT plus is not a social issue. It should not be in the 300s. Neither should disability fiction be in your 300s. Native American indigenous folktales are typically actually based in their faith system, their belief system, and should be with religious books. So challenge those things in your library. Make sure that you are using free and open resources. And ultimately, make sure that you are, thank you, make sure that you are celebrating what you do. It will encourage you, it will encourage your users, and it will give you an energy to keep doing what you're doing. By that I mean write about what you're doing, come to conferences, present, have local celebrations, make sure it's in the local press, celebrate your successes. That will keep you going. Thank you.
So we'd like to leave you with a few key resources before we open up the floor for you to ask us questions or share what you're doing. So just some things to think about, resources where you can find out more information. So Teaching for Change has a lot of good information on their website about collection development, books to think about. Reading While White is a blog that helps us kind of critically think about the books that we have as well as other topics. Edie, you want to talk about We're the People?
We the People is a small collective. There's a couple of us, Laura is here, Suhey and Aaliyah are here, who have worked with We the People. Sarah's been on We the People. Currently we're putting out a summer reading list. We critically evaluate those books, and they're all written or illustrated by authors of color. It comes out in the summer, but we are beginning to expand what we do, so keep your eyes open and be aware of what we're doing as a collective. Thank you.
Pat, do you want to talk about yours?
I recently heard about Miss Buchanan's Period of Adjustment. It's the Revisionist History podcast, and it's the story of Linda Brown's story of Brown v. Board and the displacement of black teachers as a result of that desegregation ruling. It's a really beautifully done podcast. My students have found it riveting and eye-opening, so I highly recommend it. Yeah.
And I also added Welcoming Schools as a resource. If you don't know about welcomingschools.org, they have a lot of resources available, book lists, strategies that you can use to make your library inclusive to rainbow families. So it gives you book list suggestions for different age groups. And we mentioned the Alice Library Services Special Population Children and Caregivers Toolkit. That's the one that I mentioned that the Community Forum will be working on updating that. And then we need diverse books. Rather than giving you a list of blogs, if you go to the We Need Diverse Books, if you go to the Resources tab, they have links to lots and lots of different blogs of recommended books that represent all types of diversity. So I encourage you to go check there to see, just to keep up with books that are being evaluated and what people have to say. So now, here is our contact information, but we want to hear from you. There's a microphone in the back of the room. If you have any questions for us, or you would like to share something that you're doing, the microphone is over there in the back of the room.
Hi. Thank you for all this wonderful information and perspectives, especially given in a more structural context is very helpful. One of the areas that I've been trying to read about and not found a lot is classism, which suffuses actually each ethnic group. And I was just wondering if you have any resources. I really feel like we basically represent white middle class, both in our schools and in the libraries. And I was wondering how to become more aware and about classism.
I would definitely read, as an adult, I would read Evicted. I cannot remember that guy's name. He's an amazing author and has recently written another article in the New York Times about how poverty produces poverty because of the systemic inequities that are limiting resources for families and kids and everyone. But the literature is pretty conclusive in showing that racial disparities are also associated with income inequality and resource inequality. So it's not possible to separate these out. And I think helping kids understand, my experience with pre-service teachers and with kids is that helping them understand how racism works is, and other forms of discrimination also contributes to their understanding of classism.
And I think on that note, because I mean what we're talking about here is intersectionality, and learning more about intersectionality, reading Kimberly Crenshaw's writings. Melinda Lowe has a really great blog post. I forgot the title, but it's something like Diversity in Book Reviews. It's on her website. If you just Google Melinda Lowe and Diversity in Book Reviews, you'll find it. But she talks about how the way some books have been reviewed have been sort of through this single lens of only class or only race or only ability or only gender or whatever, whereas people, we all embody different aspects of our identity, and they all work together in different ways. And oftentimes these reviews will be like, well, there's too much going on because you can't have a black character who's also queer, who also has a disability. It's just like too much going on, it's too confusing. But that's like the actual way that some of us live, right? And so I really encourage you to read about intersectionality to understand it more and how it impacts different people in different ways. And also like reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. A lot of that book addresses classism in African American communities and how then that leads to over-policing and police brutality and black and brown men in particular being sent in really disproportionate numbers into the criminal justice system, and how that then perpetuates these systems of oppression. So yeah, there's so much to say. I think Teaching for Change probably has resources on its website about poverty. The ALA has, I think the Social Responsibilities Roundtable, I think, has the Task Force on Homelessness, and there's a lot of resources there as well. And I know Children in Libraries, the Journal for ALSC, has also had a lot of really great articles about addressing poverty and things like that. So thank you for that question.
I have a session coming up at 2:45 today and tomorrow, and we're going to talk about critical literacy, and critical literacy is going to examine power structures in books, and that really gets a class. We do it mainly, I do it through work by authors of color and with authors of color. But if you're looking at if you're examining power structures, you're looking at class issues. And of course, I've got to mention Last Stop on Market Street, which definitely is a wonderful book to examine that. And most of Renee Watson's books are as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question, yeah.
Good morning, my name is Carmen Boston, and I work for DC Public Library. And first I want to say thank you for this workshop. It was very informative. But I asked you to drop or stop using pimping. I know you meant no harm by it, but it brought up a lot of negative connotations for me. So marketing is nothing wrong with that word. So I ask you to use other words.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Moore from the Dayton Metro Library. I only know enough to be dangerous, so please forgive me if I don't say this right. I think that an important part of the picture when we're talking about working successfully with diversity has to do with family engagement in the library. And I recently was in a conversation with someone who asked, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I know in schools we know very well that African American males are being expelled at an inordinately unjust level compared to white children. And I think that in libraries we're part of that story as well. I don't have the data, but I just know we are. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was asked recently, well, what are we supposed to do about it? Yes, we know that's true in our libraries, and it's not just for teen males acting out. It's also for families with young children that are getting kicked out in our libraries. And I want to know, what do we do about it? And so I had this thought, maybe it's about instituting reparations in libraries in the ways that the schools are instituting that as an alternative to suspending children. Restorative justice. Or, is anybody doing any research about that? And if you have ideas about how to raise the professionalism in libraries in our person-to-person interactions with families and children. Go.
Go ahead. I'm just going to say briefly that ask yourselves, what does childhood look like? Just ask yourselves as a group to ask that question of yourselves, and then to begin to say, where are the lines that get crossed, and who seems to be crossing those, and by what definition is that not childhood? So I would start there, and then I'm going to turn it over to Edie, who works in libraries. I work in schools, and I work in the school library outside of the literacy classroom, and I work with kids of color, girls, boys, and we do storytelling, superhero storytelling. And the idea of that is to really expand the range of their imaginative worlds and to let them just dive into that space. Behavior can get kind of wobbly, but I know that what they're doing is sort of playing around and getting into that world.
I would just quickly say, look at your policies and procedures. Perhaps they need to be reevaluated. And allow children to be children. If they're excited and loud, don't tone police the loudness, but understand why they are and relate to them because they're having a great day.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry, Katie.
Thank you so much. My name is Carrie Reed. I'm from a library just south of Chicago. And to one of your last points there, in our efforts to be inclusive, we're trying to gather fiction books in world languages, and we're having a very difficult time. I know when I started my career about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we struggled to find books in Spanish, and now that's all we're really finding. We can't really find books in other languages, at least not into a great extent. So I'm wondering if you have any resources or know of publishers that are doing a great deal in world languages, or if you know of anyone who is working towards that aspect.
I've got a list of resources. If you go to my blog, Crazy Quilts Edie, there's a resource page of publishers, and many of those do publish foreign language books. That's one place you can look. I know there are others.
Well, and just immediately, so digital, there's the International Children's Digital Library, which has full scans of books in other languages. And so I always tell my students, if you have a family that moves in to your community that reads a different language than you have in your collection, that's an immediate place you can go to have access to those books. It may not be the newest books, but at least there's something, because I don't want a family to come in the library to leave without anything. So that's something until I can go and find more books. There's also IFLA on their website, International Federations of Library Association. They have a list of recommended books from around the world that librarians around the world have recommended books, the top books in their countries. And there are some publishers that have are getting those and acquiring those, like Enchanted Lion, or acquiring some of those and translating them.
And some libraries have actually become publishers. So the St. Paul Public Library realized that they didn't have any children's books in the Karen language, and we have a really rapidly growing Karen population, and so they started self-publishing those some stories for Karen families. So there are other ways to address the relative absence of books. So hopefully we can find some creative solutions.
I'd also recommend looking at the website for Rahat Naqvi, Naqvi. She's done a lot of work on dual language read-alouds with adults reading and interpreting their worlds with young children.
All right, so now we need to turn things back over to Lisa. She has some important information to give to you before we break for lunch. So